All right. Okay, we are going to be continuing in the story of David this morning. This morning is going to be a little bit similar to last week, at least in the very beginning of this account of David in Israel. So last week, Pastor Keith spoke on David showing kindness to Mephibosheth. And so this was, Mephibosheth was a descendant of Saul, descendant of his good friend Jonathan, and David showed kindness to Mephibosheth and had that kindness and that reconciliation happened, that kindness was accepted. And so this morning he's going to do a similar thing where he shows kindness to another person that he had dealings with, and more specifically, that person's son. So a descendant of another person, a king that he had dealt with, and this is a king of the Ammonites. So these two chapters would go really well together, and I think that's why the authors put them right next to each other, because he uses the same word that he used 3 times last week in this chapter to link the two. So, we're going to read this morning in 2 Samuel chapter 10. After this, the king of the Ammonites died, and Hanun his son reigned in his place. And David said, I will deal loyally with Hanun the son of Nahash, and his father dealt loyally with me. So David sent by his servants to console him concerning his father, and David's servants came into the land of the Ammonites. So we have here Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, and his son, he died, and his son is now reigning and takes the throne of this king of the Ammonites. So before I start, his name is Hanun, and if I say Harun on accident, I'm incredibly sorry, but I have a youth kid whose name is Harun. So if I accidentally link the name of one of my youth kids to the villain in this story, well, I apologize. I only did it once last service. So, but I saw this coming. I was like, this is going to happen. I can't say Harun. Okay, so Harun, he takes the throne, and David extends a hand of kindness to the new king. He says, I will deal loyally or kindly with Hanun. So the word kindness here is often used to establish a covenant or honor an existing covenant between two people. And we see this in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 8, where David is speaking to Jonathan. And so Jonathan, the son of the king, kind of has all the power in the relationship, but David is speaking to Jonathan. He says, deal kindly, using the same word kesed that we talked about last week, deal kindly with me because of the covenant that we have. And in 2 Samuel 9, of course, last week it says, for sure I will show you kindness, kesed, for the sake of your father Jonathan. So this is the kind of kindness that David's trying to show to Hanun. He is either wanting to continue a covenant that existed or establish a new covenant. And before we continue on, I want to pause here because there's an issue here that we need to address. And that's the last time that we heard the name Nahash. The last time we heard the name Nahash was 1 Samuel 11. And it's kind of strange to see his name again. This is the second time and the only other time that we see his name come up. And you might remember, I don't speak up here all that often, but about 10 months ago, I spoke through 1 Samuel chapter 11, which talked about Nahash and Saul. So that's the other instance that we see Nahash. And Nahash, whose name means snake, you might remember that name now. Nahash came against the Israelites and basically gave them an ultimatum and said, well, you gouge out your right eye and become our slaves. And Israel took their time to think about it, and Saul ended up gathering an army to come against the Ammonites and defeated the Ammonites, and they scattered across. So that was the last time we saw Nahash, so not a great guy. And So it drives this question of why would David have this covenant with Nahash? Like, what had happened there? Because the only time we ever see him, Nahash isn't a great dude. And many believe that it's because Nahash took David in while he was in exile. So this is while David would have been running around, like trying to escape Saul, and likely had some sort of kindness showed to him from Nahash. And so since that, David has a great memory, doesn't forget all the people who dealt kindly with him in the past. And so he either just remembers the kindness that was shown to him by Hanun's father, or he had a treaty, an agreement, a covenant with Nahash, or both. We don't really know, but that's the assumption that we can make here. So Nahash dies, and it was customary for a king in their time that when you have this agreement between two different nations, that when the king dies and a new person rises to the throne, that you send your ambassadors over to make sure that that relationship stays the same. So a king would send over his ambassadors to be like, okay, well, we had this treaty with your father, and our intention is to keep that treaty going and keep that relationship going regardless of who is on the throne. And so they would send these people to deal with kindly and loyalty to the covenant that had pre-existed that throne. So this is how Hanun deals with them. So verse 3. So it's a little weird. The verse 2 continues, says, and David's servants came into the land of the Ammonites. And then verse 3, but the princes of the Ammonites said to Hanun their lord, do you think because David has sent comforters to you that he is honoring your father? Has not David sent his servants to you to search the city and to spy it out and to overthrow it? So Hanun took David's servants and shaved off half the beard of each and cut off their garments in the middle at their hips and sent them away. When it was told David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, remain at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return. So we have to ask the question, why would they assume that David sent spies? And my first thought when I read this, my first thought is, it's projection. Like, okay, well, we know Nahash wasn't the most scrupulous guy. And so my first thought is, okay, was this projection? Are they just thinking, well, if change in leadership happens, that's one of the points where nations are the most weakest. And so there's a lot of times where nations would attack other nations because of change in leadership. And so his thought was probably, hey, we would do this to other nations. There's a change in leadership, we're going to send spies, and we're going to pretend they're ambassadors being like, are we all good? But they're going to actually spy out the capital city and see like, are they weak? Do they have a great army? Is this guy, is his leadership getting challenged? And so it might be projection that, we would do this to other nations, so that's probably what David's doing to us. Or is it simply that they just heard about David and his prior conquests? Like David, we read a couple chapters ago, David, in chapter 7, David would have had a famous name. He would have been famous for all of the victories that he had and how he rose to power and his great authority and his military might and all this stuff. And there were legends around this guy. And so if like this legendary military leader sends ambassadors to your nation, you ought to think, okay, well, are we going to be his next conquest? And so was this just them kind of playing and saying, like, okay, well, David conquers everyone. And the Israelites, they're a military power. And so are they just sending spies into our area? Maybe it was that Hanun he knew of their colored past with the Israelites, and maybe it was, okay, well, he knows the history of his father and the Israelites, and so maybe this is them continuing to seek out retaliation against the Ammonites because they hadn't always had the best relationship, and so maybe that's what Hanun remembers. But then were his actions justified? And if you think about it, you have these ambassadors coming into your area that you think are spies. Like, were their suspicions legitimate? Like, well, yeah, their suspicions were probably legitimate, but we've seen them take it too far and go to the end of being cruel. Not just distrusting them or like, maybe not disclosing everything about their nation to them, but they actually go further than that. And it was important to note that Harun, I just did it. This first time, Hanun is the aggressor here. They cut their garments in half and their beards in half. And so if you can't picture this, like I pictured their garments, I don't know why. I didn't read it right the first time. I pictured their garments getting cut, but I actually have a picture of what they would look like. Yeah, here it is. Okay, but seriously, so it was disgraceful. It was an insult for them to do this to the ambassadors of Israel, and for them not just obviously cutting your garments in half and basically only wearing a shirt with no pants. Like that would have been disgraceful in of itself, and the shame that comes with that. And they were Israelites, so they were circumcised. So that's like people who were not Israelites would have like harassed them and derided them over all that. And then to cut their beard in half was equally shameful, because someone with their beard cut in half would have lost all their dignity, because someone with a clean-shaven face would have been a slave in their time. So a free man wore a beard. And so to have their beard shaven off was completely disgraceful. And so David, he hears of what happened to them, and they're coming back into Israel, and David goes out and greets them, presumably so that no one sees them the way they are. And he goes out and greets them, and he says, hey, you guys, why don't you just stay in Jerusalem until your beards have grown back? And he's saying, I don't want you to feel disgraced when you enter back into your society, so why don't you just stay in Jerusalem? David very well could have paraded them through Israel and used them as a machine for their own propaganda against the Ammonites. He could have used them to get all of his people fired up about, oh, look at this disgrace that they've dealt on my ambassadors. Like, we have to go to war to them. But he chose not to do that. He chose to have pity on these ambassadors. And he said, hey, well, we're going to save your dignity, and you're going to wait till your beards grow back, and then you could enter back into society. And so we see that Nahash, the snake, his name meaning snake, he was nice to David at some point. And then his son, Hanun, whose name ironically means grace, or full of grace, he met David with hostility. So the contrast of these two chapters, you have these ambassadors of David going to show kindness, and one accepts him and one rejects him. He was accepted by Mephibosheth and his family, and Mephibosheth's whole family was reconciled to David in the kingdom of Israel, and the opposite happens here. And this brings up an important point for us in our lives, is that we are called ambassadors for Christ. That we are called to deliver his good news. I thought it was kind of, worked out great. I thought the Gideons were here. I was like, this is a perfect Sunday for the Gideons to be here. Because if we're talking about us being ambassadors to ambassadors of God's grace to the world, well, there's few greater examples than the Gideons, right? And he just shared. So we're called to be ambassadors for Christ. 2 Corinthians 5, Paul says this. He says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new one has come. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting the trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on the behalf of Christ to be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. We are called to be ambassadors for Christ. He wants everyone to experience the peace and eternal destiny that he offers, and we're called to take that message of reconciliation to all those that don't know him. And likewise, with all of this, some people are going to be receptive to that, and some will not be. And like in 2 Samuel 9, his kindness was graciously accepted, and those people were reconciled. So God does this for us. God reconciles us to him. And Romans 5 says that while we were still God's enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his son. While we were his enemies, while we were on the outside of his kingdom, while we were outside of his graces, he reached out to us. While we were still enemies, he reached out to us and reconciled us back to him. And so because of that, we are called, of course, to be his ambassadors, that we would call other people who have not been reconciled to God to see that reconciliation, to see that grace, to see that forgiveness, and be reconciled back to God. To enjoy the benefit of his kingdom, live in his kingdom, eat from his table. But, as it says, there's resistance to our mission. There's resistance to our mission. First, sometimes that might not come directly from people. Sometimes that might come in the form of affliction. And Paul, who writes in Corinthians about this message of reconciliation, he saw, of course, not just a lot of pushback from other people, but he saw his own body failing him in a lot of places. That he found his own affliction that wasn't given to him by other people, but like even from nature, his own body, like he found his own affliction. In Galatians 4, he talks to the Galatian church that the reason I started a church, the reason I even ministered here in the first place, is that I was basically grounded because of my own sicknesses. Like, because my body is failing me, that's why I started to minister to the Galatian people, and that's why we started this church, and it all worked out because this affliction that I had. And then, so sometimes sometimes our resistance comes from affliction. Sometimes, of course, it comes from opposition. And many apostles and disciples were no strangers to opposition. One of those stories of Paul comes out of Acts 14. It says, "But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, 'Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you. And we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and sea and all that's in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways. Yet he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness.' Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. And then the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up, entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. So sometimes you will do God's will. Sometimes you will be met with opposition. Hopefully you won't get killed over it, but sometimes we'll be met with opposition. You preach the gospel of peace, and people will hate you for it. Just as Jesus predicted. In John 1:11, he says, he came to his own, and his people did not receive him. And in John 15:25, Jesus says this, but the word that is written in the law must be fulfilled. They hated me without cause. Sometimes we have opposition. Sometimes it comes from our own affliction. Sometimes it comes from external sources and other people in the form of rejection. And sometimes you're doing the good work that God has called you to, and it might even be accepted, at least tacitly. But in the end, in action, it falls on deaf ears. And you see the fruits of your, you don't see the fruits of your seeds being sown. And I've struggled with that idea a lot, is that idea that, okay, well, here I am supposed to be a witness to other people. Here I am trying to tell people God's love and His forgiveness and the message of reconciliation, all this stuff that we're talking about, and maybe it's like accepted, but sometimes I feel like, okay, well, it's just falling on deaf ears. Like I've mentioned this to Stacy before, is that sometimes I feel like I'm just watering the weeds. And she, of course, graciously corrected me, saying, yeah, but you're not to be the one who judges what kind of soil it is. I was like, okay, well, yeah, fair enough. But we're called to be ambassadors for Christ, even when it's sowing seeds and you don't know if you're sowing seeds in the rocks or the good soil. But we're called to be ambassadors for Christ, regardless. The responses could be welcoming, it could be hostile, but our resolve should be to keep pressing through. All right, and we're going to continue in verse 6, because some may choose to reject that message completely or even choose to go to war with you. Verse 6. When the Ammonites saw that they had become a stench to David, they sent and hired the Syrians of Beth-Rehob and the Syrians of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Makkah with 1,000 men, and the men of Tob, 12,000 men. And when David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the host of the mighty men. And the Ammonites came out and drew up in battle array at the entrance of the gate, and the Syrians of Zobah and of Rehob and the men of Tob and Makkah were by themselves in the open country. When Joab saw that the battle was against him, both in front and in the rear, he chose some of the best men of Israel and arrayed them against the Syrians. The rest of his men he put in charge of Abishai, his brother, and in the charge of Abishai, his brother, and arrayed them against the Ammonites. And he said, if the Syrians are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come and help you. Be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him. So Joab and the people who were with him drew near to battle against the Syrians, and they fled before him. And when the Ammonites saw that the Syrians fled, they likewise fled before Abishai and entered the city. Then Joab returned from fighting against the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. But when the Syrians saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered themselves together. And Hadadezer sent and brought out the Syrians who were beyond the Euphrates. They came to Helam with Shobach, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, and at their head. And when it was told David, he gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came to Helam. The Syrians arrayed themselves against David and fought with him. And the Syrians fled before Israel, and David killed of the Syrians the men of 700 chariots and 40,000 horsemen, and wounded Shobach, the commander of the army, so that he died there. And when all the kings who were servants of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and became subject to them. So the Syrians were afraid to save the Ammonites anymore. Well, that goes without saying. Afraid to help them anymore. We're not going to help you. So the people of Ammon, it says that the people of Ammon found themselves, or had made themselves repulsive. They knew they had done this. David didn't reject the Ammonites. they made themselves repulsive to Israel. David offered grace and was met with hostility and war. And this is clear because as soon as these ambassadors came and left, they immediately went out and hired the Assyrians. So it was common practice in the ancient world. And 1 Chronicles 19:6 said that the Ammonites paid 1,000 talents to the Syrians. So when I hear something like this, okay, 1,000 talents, I always think, okay, well, I have no real frame of reference, and I'm always curious, like, okay, what does 1,000 talents mean? So a talent, you might know, is about the weight of a man, and so a Babylonian talent would have been measured at 130 pounds, later be 108, and some later estimates would have put that at around 67 pounds. And it was worth about 20 years of labor. So at the most conservative estimate, this would have been 33 tons of silver was delivered for this army of Syria. And so that is all, so at least that much. It may be more. And so this is the part that, you get lost in the weeds, is like, okay, what does that mean in US dollars? It's like, okay, no one really knows. You can't really equate it, but it's probably over $1 billion. It's like a lot of money that they paid for this army. And so when David heard of it, he heard of them gathering the army. He gathered his army together. It says that he gathered Joab and all of the mighty men. And so this is the first mention of David's mighty men, calling them the army of mighty men. And so I have a few people described as these mighty men. So likely these were the ones that went with him. Remember, David is nothing without his mighty men. They were nothing without him, because they were the people that gathered around David when they were also down and out, just like David. They were outcasts. They were exiles, and they gathered together. 1 Samuel 22 in the cave of Adullam. That's where he first gathered his army. So certainly some of these would have been those guys. But this is what we know about David's mighty men. There was a guy by the name of Adino the Eznite, and he had killed 800 men at one time. So pretty fierce dude. Jashobeam killed 300 men at one time. And then we have Benaiah, who killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day, which is very specific, but it sounds hard. I don't know much about killing lions, but sounds difficult. And if it was written down, it's probably pretty difficult. Killing a lion in a pit on a snowy day. I mean, uphill from his house. I don't know. He killed 2 legendary Moab warriors. So he killed 2 other guys who were also legends themselves. And then he killed this huge Egyptian warrior who was 5 cubits tall. So these were guys that certainly would have had a reputation just as David had a reputation. So an army heard of David, bringing his, his magnificent men, his legends, certainly would have raised some concern for the army that had to go against them. So Joab, he arrives with his army, and he sees that, they gathered around him both before him and behind him. And so as they approached the Ammonite city, they found themselves surrounded, which is like, I'm no general, but I know that's a bad place to be. You don't want to find yourself surrounded. And so it looked bad for the army of Israel. And Joab had only one strategy in this whole battle: attack. And so it's interesting to me that Joab didn't lay out any plan for defeat or retreat or surrender. There was no contingency plan here. He said, hey, this is all or nothing for Israel. And he's like, be courageous, be strong, because God has given you this land and this city. And Joab himself has faith that he's not going to let that fade away just because of some armies around us. And so he made up a plan, and he says to his people this inspiring speech of courage. Let us be strong, have the courage and strength despite your feeling and despite your circumstance. Have faith be strong for our people and for the cities of God. Remember who you're fighting for. Remember who you're going to battle for. You're going to battle for your people. You're going to battle for the Lord. And the Lord is going to do what's good in his sight. Just as David has said in chapters before, it's that idea of, okay, well, if we're to come out victorious, it's because God handed us the victory. And so take hold of that victory that God has given us. This is Joab's speech in this chapter is the only place in the chapter where God's even mentioned, and certainly in this capacity of God's gonna do this. Whatever it is, God's got it. I feel like for us, when we have been overcome by our circumstances, we feel that the world's crashing in around us, or maybe it has to do with our own temptation, our own vices. May we remember that God has delivered us victory already. In 1 John 5, 1 through 5, it says, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves whoever has been born of him. By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and obey his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. For everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world except the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? So as we look at our own lives through the filter, through the worldview of Scripture, may we know that Jesus has already claimed victory over our enemies. And it's our job to have faith enough to take that up, to take a hold of that. I think sometimes it's easy for us to get wrapped up in the things of the world. Sometimes it's easy for us to have bad days. Right now in this whole season, maybe it's a bad day when people who align with our political ideologies seem to be losing. It's easy to be wrapped up in fear when maybe our candidate doesn't win, and maybe all this is going to ring true closer to the end of the year, but we can have a lot of fear in that. And I'm included, but we can have a lot of fear in that. And let's not forget, there's someone who's declared victory in our own lives first, and then there's someone whose kingdom is going to reign forever. The kingdoms here are going to pass and they're going to fade away, but there's someone that reigns king forever. There's Jesus that holds creation together. God appoints our own leaders. So maybe we need to practice trusting in him a little more, having faith in him. Our hope doesn't lie in anyone or anything here. It lies in heaven. God's going to take care of us. And he holds our entire lives in this cosmic ecosystem. He holds it all together. Sometimes I think it's this lack of faith or lack of courage or understanding or even our own complacency that causes us to fall away from a trust in God. Makes us not want to take hold of that victory promised in Christ. Like Joab, have no contingency plan, have no plan for failure or retreat or surrender, but to take hold of that victory. As Paul says, what's the worst that's going to happen to you? Paul was a man wrought with affliction, wrought with opposition. And what does Paul say? He's like, okay, well, to live is Christ, to die is gain. You're gonna kill me? Like, okay, great. No problem. You're gonna let me live? All right. You're gonna throw me in jail? What's jail gonna do to me? I'm still gonna proclaim his word. You're gonna let me go free? Well, I'm gonna preach his word even more fervently than before. It's what can God do to us? Instead, we should be living this victory that God has handed us. We should be living in that boldness, in that courage, in that love, that faith, that devotion, that action. So, going back to this story, these armies, they fled. They fled from Joab and Israel, and they were defeated, and Joab engaged the Syrians, and the Syrians lost, and the Ammonites saw the Syrians running. They're like, oh, well, if our greatest warriors are leaving, like, oh, maybe we need to retreat too. And they retreated, and they fled and entered the city of Abishai, and so the Israelites had won this battle. When they were surrounded, they had won. And then they go in and they engage them once again. They had this unfinished business in Rabbah, and they bring armies up to them, and they're getting nowhere. And David has to go be with his army and bring them victory, and they get a victory with David there. And this is kind of like I feel like this is a message from God for David that, oh, he should be with his army he should be with his army, with Joab and the rest sieging the city, because they needed him for victory. And what does David end up doing? He goes back to Israel, and he stays in the comfort of his palace. And it's at this point that they're engaging this army yet again, that David's back in the comfort of his own palace, and he falls into sin with Bathsheba, and we're going to hear more about all of that. And so it ends up not going well for David. And so I feel like he wasted that warning from God. So when we walk away from the story, like, there's a lot we can say about David here. But I think there's one thing that we haven't hit on necessarily, is that David, in all his actions, he continued to step out in boldness and love and kindness towards other people. And he chose often, over and over again, that to treat people fairly and with trust and kindness. And you look at his life and you see his gratitude, like in 2 Samuel 7, you see his gratitude for the throne that God's given him, and he's been in this position for a while, and you see the abundance of blessing in his life, and he doesn't forget all the people who had brought him along in the way. He certainly doesn't forget all that God had provided for him and everything, and he's just endlessly grateful for the grace that God has shown him, even though he was nothing but a lowly shepherd boy. And so my question is, do we live our lives out of that same gratefulness? Like, wouldn't it be something? Like, we live in this culture, and we love this culture around us, and this everything around us seems to be endlessly critical of other people. We have contempt for everyone around us, and this undue suspicion of everyone's motivations and everyone's actions. And we look at people's lives and we see what they're doing, and we think, oh, well, like, we just try to pick it apart and judge them and have contempt for everything that they're doing, and never give people the benefit of the doubt. That's the culture that we live in, this culture of criticism and gossip. Like, wouldn't it be incredible if we as a church, we stood out from that culture and decided not to engage with that stuff, but instead start believing the best in people, trusting people that they are who they say they are? That wouldn't it be incredible if we were the ones who were long-suffering, that we were the ones who were peacemakers, who loved deeply and showed kindness and were slow to anger, not quick to anger, abounding in love like our God had first shown us? That we had a church that not just had proper doctrine, orthodoxy, but orthopraxy, proper practice, and that we were modeling the type of church that God would like to see. And yet, a lot of times, even amidst the church, we look a lot like the world, where we attack one another for secondary theological issues, or we attack other people on how they do church, or how they are involved in church, or not involved in church, or we just constantly criticizing people on their own faith and their own action, their own process with God, when that's really between them and God. That's not for us to be slamming people around us, because like Jesus said, you will know you are my disciples. Other people will know you are my disciples by this, how you criticize one another. Right? That's what Jesus said. No, of course not. They will know you are my disciples by how you love one another. Like, wouldn't it be incredible if people saw the church as a place of forgiveness and reconciliation? And it kind of brings me to this question, and we're going to leave it rhetorical, although kind of answering it by saying it, but it's like, are we going to hate heaven? It's like, oh, well, no, we're not going to hate heaven, but like, think about it. Are we going to hate everyone there, and are we going to be at peace with everyone? Are we going to be appalled at some of the people that made it into heaven? Like, that person made it into heaven? Like, why, if we're not going to act like that in heaven, why are we acting like that now? Instead, we should hold the position like David did early on, his good examples of like David did and beginning in these chapters. We should hold our examples of David being like, man, God, I do not deserve this. I am not worthy of any of this. Like, maybe we should be appalled that we made it to heaven. No, God, how did I make it here? Not like this person, like, how did you let me in here? Your abounding grace, your abounding love, your abounding forgiveness, and your reconciliation is nothing that I deserve. There's nothing that I could have done for that. And yet you've dealt graciously with me. You've brought blessing in my life. You've reconciled me to you. You've been nothing but gracious, abounding in grace and love for me in my life here, despite my own garbage. So as we step out, let's remember God forgave us first. He delights in us. And as we go, we step out in boldness, believing the best in others, extending kindness, and loving deeply. Would you pray with me? God, I pray that this morning as we participate in this act of remembrance and communion, that we would remember the grace and love, forgiveness that you have first shown us. That we would remember how you've dealt kindly with us, that we would bring that message to other people. I thank you for your ultimate gift in our lives. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.